Today, I'd like to begin by referencing something I said a week ago in Lecture 13, the lecture entitled The Decline of Magic. We spoke briefly of that famous epistolary novel that was so popular in the 18th century, Pamela, or Virtue Rewarded, of 1740. The reward of which the title speaks was marriage, to the very individual who had imperiled her virtue for years on end. Once Pamela was married to Mr. B, she engaged in the cultural pursuits befitting her status, and she reported on them in a number of letters. And it is in these letters that we gather that a night at the Italian opera was effectively a waste of time. Pamela didn't understand the Italian language and had no idea what was going on the stage. Without a text to understand, the music to her was mere vibration of air. It had nothing to say. It didn't speak to her. It didn't tell her anything. The sounds may have their charms, she said, but in the end they offer a mere temporary delight. By the time you get home, you're left with nothing but a quickly fading memory. The most famous composer associated with the Italian opera in London at this time was George Friedrich Handel. He was a German by birth, but had pursued an international career, which took him first to Italy and then to England. These are the pages about him in the textbook. Once again, an oil portrait of the composer. In previous classes, we have looked at other such portraits, and I said that they tell us a lot about the status and image of composers. So what does this portrait tell us? Compared to Vivaldi and Barbara Strozzi, Handel is certainly in a more formal attire, as if he were ready to go out and meet the world. The other two, by comparison, would have had to get dressed first. There is maybe a slight air of informality about Handel, in that his overcoat is unbuttoned and that he is leaning casually on the piano. But the wig almost robs him of individuality. You have to zoom in to feel that you're encountering the actual person. And even then his face doesn't reveal much. There's another portrait of Handel which shows him seated at the keyboard, presumably in the privacy of his own home. Once again he is in his Sunday best, complete with wig, and once again one picks up a sense of reserve about him. Handel was, in fact, an intensely private person, and he jealously guarded his personal boundaries. He was content to live by himself alone, and had no romantic life that we know of. A few decades ago, he was convincingly linked to what you might call the gay scene in 18th century London. But we cannot read his mind or his heart, and he wouldn't have let us. The nearest we have to Handel in a casual setting is this third portrait. No wig this time. He is bald and not ashamed of it. His shirt is unbuttoned, but he is still wearing that same red overcoat. And from his demeanor, I don't get the impression that he would welcome conversation at this point. He is just too busy composing to do more than look up. Handel was an independent businessman, not in the service of employers. The formality of his portraits could be a way of affirming his independent status. But he is understated about it. He doesn't have to shout it from the rooftops. Early on in his London years, Handel was already rich enough to buy himself a house. Here you see a satellite view of London today. Seen from the air, it looks like a shapeless mass of streets and buildings, with only the river and Buckingham Palace on the left to give us a rough idea of which is where. 3 centuries ago, it was quite different. Most of what we saw in the satellite image wasn't there as yet in the 18th century. Handel's house was then at the very edge of town, bordering directly on the countryside. It was a new development. This is a reconstruction of what Handel's house originally looked like. And here is that same house today, 25 Brook Street in London. There is a marker on the wall reminding us that Handel lived here no less than 36 years of his life. By a bizarre coincidence, this house is next door to another monument in the history of music. It's the apartment where Jimi Hendrix lived for a while in 1967. Both houses are now part of a museum known as the Handel and Hendrix. You can relive the 1960s in the reconstruction of Hendrix's humble apartment, and perhaps wonder, as I have, at the complete absence of drug paraphernalia. I see a teapot there on the tray on the floor, but no bong anywhere. But then I assume the museum has to be appropriate for children. And here is the interior of Handel's house, more specifically, the room in which he almost certainly composed the two pieces that are awesome mix numbers 55 and 57. In a few moments I will play a video with the second of those two items, the aria Ombra mai fu, but not before showing you the Italian Opera Theatre in the Haymarket. This is where those two arias were first performed. Like innumerable theatres from this period, the Haymarket Theatre has gone up in flames many times. Nothing remains of the original building, but this is where Handel ran his own opera company, financed by himself. Awesome mix number 57 is an aria from Handel's opera Cerce. It is one of his most famous compositions, and it qualifies for inclusion in this course because it is unbelievably awesome. The main character of Cerce is the ancient Persian ruler Xerxes. It is he who sings the aria all the way at the beginning of the opera, immediately after the overture. At that point of the story, we know nothing of Xerxes, but we see him contemplating a tree and marveling at the shadow it casts. Never, he sings, was there a shade of any plant that was more cherished, lovely, and sweet. In the following clip, we see this aria performed, not in the context of the actual opera, but in an imagined setting in Paris, at a gathering of aristocracy in some private residence in the mid-18th century. You will notice that there is a sort of subplot in this clip, which is told entirely by the eyes of the people present. You can tell from the subplot that this is a world of personal cruelty. And you'll also notice something else. The ancient image of Xerxes, as you can see it here in the stone carving, seems to project conventional masculinity, if in the massive beard alone. The opera does not necessarily imply that its Xerxes is different, but the ruler is not given a deep, booming bass voice as one might perhaps expect. In fact, he has the voice range of a soprano. In the 18th century, this soprano range voice was produced by an adult male singer who had the voice of a boy, but could still sing it with the power of a grown man. A surgical procedure, castration, had made it possible to prevent the onset of puberty and thus to preserve the original boy's voice. Opera lovers in the 18th century were wild about the so-called castratos. Yet their appearance bewildered many others, and would almost certainly have horrified a bourgeois woman like Pamela, as something freakish or monstrous. This etching of an actual opera performance in London in the 1720s exaggerates the physical traits of castratos. They were bulky, ungainly, clumsy, with strangely uneven physical proportions. And yet castratos were the musical superstars of their day. The most successful among them earned top salaries and were in demand in opera theatres throughout Europe. And however incongruous it may seem, it was the castratos who were called upon to take the lead in stories about the great rulers, generals, and heroes of antiquity. You would see the great Julius Caesar appear on stage in full army outfit, an impressive figure, a commanding presence, dignified and majestic, until he opened his mouth, and out came this high-pitched but crystal-clear and powerful soprano voice. Also mix number 55 is from an opera about Julius Caesar. Its full Italian title is Giulio Cesare in Egitto, Julius Caesar in Egypt. The historic Caesar conquered Egypt in 47 BC. He encountered there two siblings of royal blood, Cleopatra and her younger brother Ptolemy. Caesar and Cleopatra became lovers and even produced offspring. But Caesar's relationship with Ptolemy got off on a bad start. The young man, he was 15 at the time, hoped to win Caesar's favor by offering him the decapitated head of another Roman, Pompey, with whom Caesar had had a long-running feud. It did not go well. Caesar is reported to have been deeply upset and angry. Here is that event as enacted in the HBO series Rome, which aired in 2005.
We have a gift for you, glorious excellency, that we think you will be very pleased with.
We're going to make him a body, and moving arms and legs, and do a mime show with real animals and everything.
Silence! Shame on the house of Ptolemies for such barbarity. Shame.
You are enemies.
He was a consul of Rome!
And here is that same event as enacted in Handel's opera Giulio Cesare, composed in 1724, a little over 3 centuries ago. In this scene, Ptolemy is not actually present. Caesar deals with an Egyptian general, Aquila, here in army outfit, who has brought him the box with its macabre contents. Mercifully, there are no castratos today, but countertenors can accomplish the same thing by means of falsetto. There will be no subtle titles, allowing us to relive Pamela's experience. But before I start the clip, one important point. Although there is music going on from beginning to end in this clip, you'll notice that the orchestra doesn't play in the first 30 seconds of the clip. During that half minute, it is only the basso continuo you hear, accompanying the voices. This is so-called recitative. But as Julius Caesar gets more and more agitated, he reaches a boiling point, and then he launches into an aria. That is where the orchestra enters. It's kind of the same all or nothing principle we saw in a different context last week. What you will see is not the aria of the awesome mix, but it is worth watching a short sample of it.
Tu, involati, parti, al tuo signore di, che l'opere dei regi san di bene o di mal, son sempre esempio, e non è re che deve no, che esempio. Cesare, frena l'ire, a me, vero alla reggia, gli occhi di sole, a tramutarsi veggia. Sei, poi gli occhi miei, sei tutto cruda, sei tutto cruda, sei tutto cruda. E piloto sei, poi gli occhi miei, sei tutto cruda.
This aria, like most opera arias at this time, is conceived like the Vivaldi concerto we saw in Lecture 14, the lecture entitled Matter and Form. In a few moments we will just listen to the aria again, and you'll notice that the orchestra begins with a ritornello. The solo voice enters after that ritornello, briefly alludes to the theme, but then engages in vocal pyrotechnics without themes of any kind. All this is exactly what the violin did in Vivaldi's concerto. Although you do hear the orchestra occasionally during the vocal solo, by and large the instrumental accompaniment is provided by the continuo. When Caesar is done with his first statement in this aria, you'll hear the orchestral ritornello briefly, and then he goes on again. It is all exactly in the Vivaldi concerto. In fact, you could say, and many people have said, that an aria at this time was like a concerto for voice and orchestra. After this horrifying gift, Julius Caesar is understandably wary of Ptolemy, so the scene in which the two finally meet is fraught with tension from the beginning. Caesar wants to approach this Egyptian ruler as cautiously as possible. He likens the situation to that of a hunter who is stalking his prey in a stealthy manner. What you see here in the slide is the lyrics of the aria in which he says exactly that. And that aria, Va tacito e nascosto, is the item in the awesome mix. Here is what Caesar says. The wily huntsman goes silently and stealthily when he seeks his prey, and the person who is disposed to do evil does not want people to see the deceit in his heart. That is not a whole lot of text for an aria that is going to last more than 7 minutes. Even if Pamela could have understood Italian, she might still have felt that there was too much vibration of air going on here. But let's now look at the way the aria is put together. Once again, it is conceived almost exactly like the Vivaldi concerto. Here you see the alternation between orchestral ritornellos on the one hand and the vocal solos on the other. The letters A, B, A refer to the basic form of the aria. The second A is a literal restatement of the first. In fact, since it is completely identical, the composer does not even need to bother writing it out. At the end of the B section, he directs the performers to go back all the way to the beginning and play the A section a second time. In Italian, that direction is da capo, the equivalent of English from the top. Let's go to the score written by Handel himself. Here is the last bit of that same aria, Va tacito e nascosto. What you see on this page is the end of the B section, so the A section should follow, at least in performance. Of course, it's not written here, but when we bring our magnifying glass, we can read Handel's own words, da capo. This was the convention in the vast majority of arias written in the early 18th century. As a genre, this type of aria is known as the da capo aria. There is another parallel between this aria and Vivaldi's violin concerto. This is the changes of key of which I spoke before. In the previous lecture, we saw that Vivaldi's key plan was basically two 1-5-1 cadences with a section in a minor key in between. Handel's aria follows exactly the same plan. And there is yet another parallel between aria and concerto. This is the so-called cadenza. Let me explain what this is. As you can see, the A section has two solo passages. The second of these is the last time you hear the solo voice within the A section, so it needs to end with an appropriately firm conclusion. And this should happen at a place marked by the blue triangle, for that is the concluding cadence of the second solo. And this cadence sounds like this. Now, how are you going to give special emphasis to this cadence? That is where the device of the cadenza comes in. You begin to play the final cadence, but instead of concluding it right away, like we just heard, you interrupt it precisely at the moment when the final chord should come, like this. And that open-ended chord receives a fermata, that semicircle with a dot, to indicate that the performers can extend that moment as long as they like. So the progression is left hanging in the air indefinitely. Now the soloist can take his time and give us even more technical fireworks improvised on the spot. Only when he is done does he signal to the conductor that the final ritornello can bring the aria to an end. I've illustrated all this in the first A section, but in practice it happens only in the second. Because that is the end of the aria as a whole, and the opportunity for the singers to put all the stops before he leaves the stage. Although there is not such a cadenza in the Vivaldi concerto, it would become an absolutely standard convention in concertos until our own time. Examples are awesome mix numbers 76 and 84, two piano concertos by Brahms and Ravel. At this point, it may be worth watching a clip of the Handel aria in our awesome mix, and here it is, the encounter between Caesar and Ptolemy, and the aria about the wily hunter. The whole aria lasts 7 minutes, I will illustrate the ritornello form in the diagram under the video image. You can follow it step by step. This will be helpful for the exam, which could very well feature a question about this formal principle. Enjoy. There is an important point to underline about arias in this period. Since they begin with the A section and also end with it, characters cannot undergo development, or at least none that the music can reflect. Their mood doesn't change. They haven't come to new insights or adopted new angles on the problem. Arias represent a single emotion in monolithic fashion. It's as if time is brought to a halt. The action stops, all actors freeze, and the emotion alone is allowed to be fully expressed until the action can continue. Those emotions are thought of as universal ones. You can have the exact same emotion as Julius Caesar, and so can I. If, God forbid, I have a fender bender tomorrow with someone who had already been driving quite aggressively, I probably should be wary, and so I might justifiably sing this very aria before stepping out of the car. You can tell all this also from the lyrics. Note that the text doesn't say anything about Caesar or Ptolemy, or about Egypt and the Roman Republic, or anything else that pins down the aria in time and space. It is all generalities. The advantage of this is that you can reuse an aria, for the same emotion may arise in another opera. All you need is a character who has reason to be cautious and who likens himself to a hunter. Believe it or not, this aria, Va tacito e nascosto, was not originally even written for Julius Caesar. At the place where we find it in Handel's autograph score, shown here, it is given to a character named Berenice. This character was removed from the opera before its premiere, and so Handel was left with a great aria, but no one to sing it. So why not create a spot for Caesar to have that same emotion so that he can use the aria? There is a fun movie about the phenomenon of castratos in the 18th century. Much of it takes place in London, and in fact there is a prominent role for Handel in here as well, though not one that will especially endear him to viewers. The movie is called Farinelli. It is based on the life of Carlo Broschi, also known as Farinelli, who was perhaps the most famous castrato of the 18th century. The movie makers did a wonderful job of recreating the performance of opera in this period. And there is one clip that ties in perfectly with the things I have just discussed. The clip shows the performance of one aria, or rather part of that aria. The musical form of arias in this period is so conventional that you can already predict how the music will unfold. The makers of the movie took the second A section of the aria to be used in the scene. Once again, I will make sure that we can follow the form in a diagram while the video is playing. Now, as I said before, there is no character development taking place within an aria. But in this movie clip, it turns out that there is a separate story taking place in the opera theatre itself. And that story is brilliantly interwoven with the aria form. Judge for yourself. In a few moments, we will turn to a direct contemporary of Handel, Johann Sebastian Bach. Bach never wrote operas, but he composed plenty of music that followed the basic compositional structure of opera and that of arias. And his life offers interesting contrasts with that of Handel. As I said before, Handel was an independent businessman. Opera was the venture that he financed and ran. It involved the risk of failure, of bankruptcy, but it also had the potential to make him very wealthy. So as a composer, he had broken free from the conditions of service in which most other musicians worked. He was his own man. He could do what he liked, write whatever music he pleased. He was free to the extent that you can be free in the marketplace. But as I said, it was a risky life. You needed to have real business savvy and know how to handle money. Handel did know that. He prudently invested his money in profit-making companies by buying stocks. If an opera turned out to be a complete flop, he could cash in some of his investments to make up for the financial disaster. It was his safety net protecting him from bankruptcy and poverty. Now, at this point in history, several companies in London were making good money capturing humans along the west coast of Africa, shipping them in chains to the New World, and selling them there as slaves. Here is an example. It is the so-called Royal African Company of England. And what you see before you is a list of investors who provided financial support for the business in 1720. It is on the second page of this document that we find the name of George Frederick Handel, 4 years before he was to compose the opera Giulio Cesare. What was going on here? Of one thing we can be sure. This was not some stockbroker investing the money for him and making dubious choices without his knowledge. Handel was perfectly aware of the nature of the business he supported. Here is the actual agreement of 1720, in which he bought stock in the Royal African Company. He did it in person and signed the agreement in his own hand. What we can say, therefore, is that Handel did not object in principle to the idea of enslaving other humans, and indeed was prepared to enjoy the financial security it could afford him. There is no way of telling how much he knew about the actual reality of the Royal Africa Company, the cruelty, brutality, and the cost in human lives. Here is a document that gives an idea of the sort of business Handel helped finance, in a part of the world far away from the Italian opera and the da capo aria. Of 60,000 humans shipped across the Atlantic over a span of 10 years, more than 14,000 died on the passage. That is about 1 in 4. There was a continuous need for new labor, as mortality rates among slaves in the West Indies were appallingly high. Like all aspects of contemporary life, even music could not extricate itself from an economy that rested, in good part, on the slave trade. But let's now turn to Bach and the conditions of his life. Once again, there is an oil painting to greet us, one of several that were made of this composer. Bach never had himself painted in anything other than formal attire. He never seems to relax. The shirt is buttoned up and fits tightly around his neck. The wig is not luxurious like those of Vivaldi and Handel, but looks as if there is a hairnet stretched tightly to keep the locks compressed and neatly in place. If the human face in general is a window to the soul, then this window appears closed, not likely to open up anytime soon. Cracking a smile is not his style. Bach is a serious man, frowning, squinting, pursing his lips, not nearly as relaxed as Handel was in any of his portraits. I wouldn't say Bach's look is hostile, but you do get the impression that he had endured a lot in life, or at least that he had taken badly certain things that had happened to him. There seems to be a certain bitterness that has become permanently etched in his face. Bach worked most of his life in the city of Leipzig. And unlike the independent businessman Handel, he worked for a salary, was under contract, and had to do as he was told by his employer. That employer was the Church of St. Thomas, or Thomaskirche in German, a Lutheran church. Here's an engraving of that church made in Bach's lifetime. The composer was in charge not only of the musical worship in the Thomaskirche, but also of the education of choir boys in the Thomasschule, the school of St. Thomas. You can see that school at the very end of the square, the tall building with at least 6 stories. Thanks to a lifetime of musical composition that Bach devoted to this place, the Thomaskirche is now a tourist attraction, with visitors coming from all over the world. About 10 years ago, I visited a conference in nearby Erfurt and seized the opportunity to visit this historical site myself. What I remember most of all is how surprisingly small the church was. All those cantatas, oratorios, and passions that over the course of decades have become part of my life, all of them were first performed here, in a place hallowed by the sheer weight of music history. But the Thomaskirche is not exactly a cathedral. It is a rather unassuming building. To me, it felt there was a strange mismatch between this relatively ordinary church and the incredible investment of creative energy that Bach put into it, not to mention the contribution to humanity. It is well known that he often experienced the conditions of service as demeaning. There is no way of telling how much that may have contributed to the hint of bitterness I picked up, perhaps wrongly, in his portrait. Handel, by comparison, was a free man. But he was also a man who lived under the perpetual risk of business failure and bankruptcy. If that were to happen, he would be left to his own devices, destitute, unable to pay his bills, kicked out on the street, unable to afford medical care, new clothes, or even food. The advantage of serving an employer, on the other hand, is that the employer would take care of you if you became old and infirm, kept paying your salary, would pay the health care of you and your family, no matter how much it cost. The relationship between master and servant was understood like that between parent and child. The servant was not free, any more than an underage child is free. But parents are also supposed to take care of their children, and so were the patrons of musicians. This had been the universal custom in Europe since time immemorial. So in the end, the issue may have come down for many composers to how well they could tolerate the conditions of service. It's like the way some children of the same parents are rebellious and others compliant. We will soon witness quite different responses among the great classical composers Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. As I've said before, the issue was going to become critical in this period. Since we started with Handel's house, let's now conclude with Bach's. It is that same school of St. Thomas where he and his family lived in accommodations provided for free by the Church of St. Thomas. There are still black and white photographs of that school, for it was not demolished until 1902, well after the invention of photography. We have seen the room where Handel composed. And here is the house where Bach conceived all the works that have immortalized his name. And that is where we leave things for today. As always, to be continued.
Thank you.